The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents
Y'all Just Want to Sin.
So I spent most of the month of March in Australia on the Unholy Trinity Down Under tour, myself, Aaron Raw, and Seth Andrews from The Thinking Atheist. And we had a great time, and just before the Melbourne event, I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in a conversation. It was sponsored by the City Bible Forum of Melbourne. And I've already posted the video of that, in exchange between myself and a gentleman by the name of Shane Rogerson, who's a minister of some sort down there in that area. And it was organized by Robert Martin, who also came to the Melbourne event and then posted some blog posts about it. When I got back home, I was directed to those blog posts, and I saw something that kind of surprised me. I mean, we'd had good conversation, and there was a blog post that just kind of caught me off guard because it didn't seem to be of the same quality of conversation about the topics that we had had while I was there. And I want to kind of address the blog post, but that's not the whole point of this, because the blog post is just one example of a common criticism or counter-apologetic, I suppose, launched by many Christians in particular. And it's just, y'all want to sin. So let's take a look at whether or not we want to sin. So first, a little relevant background. Richard Carrier is a friend of mine. I've interviewed him for this Atheist Debates project on the subject of debates. He is a professional historian specializing in the intellectual history of Greece and Rome, particularly as it relates to science and religion. And recently he's published a book. It's a huge tome. It's over 700 pages that's titled On the Historicity of Jesus. And it attempts to evaluate the likelihood that Jesus actually existed as a historical figure. Now, prior to this book, he'd released another book called Proving History, where he'd laid out the groundwork for what he was going to do. And essentially, the argument in Proving History is that he feels we should be able to use Bayes' theorem, which is used to calculate probabilities, to assess historical claims to determine how likely they are to actually be true. And that this might be a better way of evaluating historical claims than the default way, which in many cases for historians is just to assume that if something is reported as true, and if someone is reported as a real person, just to go ahead and assume that that's the case until we have reason not to. Now, he, in Proving History, came to the conclusion that it is improbable that Jesus existed. And there's no denying that his view of this is not the consensus among historians. It may be at some point, I don't know. But it has ruffled some feathers. And the gentleman that I spoke about, Robert Martin, wrote a blog post for this, and I wanted to kind of read portions of that blog post because the argument that he uses, or the particular tact that he takes, is pretty much, y'all just want to sin. The title of the blog post is The Potential Bias of Richard Carrier, and it begins and reads as follows. The well-known atheist and Jesus myth proponent Richard Carrier recently admitted to being polyamorous. This means that he's openly admitted to having sexual relationships with multiple people at the same time. This admission and Carrier's lifestyle have implications for his historical Jesus scholarship. This admission now gives Carrier a reason to find Jesus as a myth. He has revealed himself no longer an unbiased observer just examining the evidence. The Christian perspective on marriage fairly clearly states that a polyamorous lifestyle is wrong. Jesus made it pretty clear that marriage was for one man and one woman. For example, in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. The blog post continues, it could be that Carrier has made his assessment of the evidence and concluded that Jesus is a myth and therefore lives a life contrary to Jesus' teaching. But crucially, Carrier's admission has now given him powerful reasons to not find Jesus historical. Carrier has clear motivation for bias. Is that true? Actually, that blog post is a rather sleazy attempt at the poisoning the well fallacy. There were people who immediately identified it as an ad hominem fallacy. And to be fair, he doesn't explicitly make the ad hominem fallacy because he doesn't say Richard Carrier's position should be disregarded because he has a bias against Jesus' teachings. But he does imply that, and he suggests it, and that's why it's more accurately defined as a poisoning the well fallacy. Essentially, while he's not necessarily saying that Carrier has a bias, he's saying, he could have a bias, and he wants to live this sinful lifestyle, and that could prejudice his results. But in addition to this being a poisoning the well fallacy, it's exceptionally poor reasoning. It makes a number of simple and obvious mistakes. The first of which is that Carrier may or may not be biased, but if if he is in fact biased, his bias need only extend to whether or not he accepts the teachings of Jesus as authoritative and instructive, and whether we're under some obligation. He doesn't need to hold the position that Jesus is a myth. He could believe that Jesus is a myth, and then that disregards all of it. Or he could believe that Jesus actually existed, but that we don't have an accurate representation of his words and deeds, and he still wouldn't be under any obligation to follow. He could believe that Jesus existed, that we do have accurate representation of his words, but not perhaps his deeds. He could believe that Jesus existed, that we have a good, accurate representation of his words and deeds, and even accept that he performed miracles, and perhaps even accept that he's divine, and still hold the position that he is under no obligation to consider the teachings of Jesus binding or authoritative on him. He can reject these things on any number of grounds. So the mere fact that he has a lifestyle or is of an orientation that is in conflict with what this particular interpretation of biblical marriage does not mean that he has a bias against whether or not Jesus existed. It means that, if anything, at most he has a bias against the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus doesn't have to be a myth for that to be the case. So to extend this several links down the chain to say that, he's got this polyamorous bias, and he may then in fact be setting out to prove that Jesus didn't exist, is simply wrong-headed. It is fallacious. The second problem with this entire argument is that Carrier was an atheist and polyamorous long before he came to his current position on the historicity of Jesus. In fact, several years ago, when he and I had a conversation, he made it clear that he wasn't overly concerned about the historicity of Jesus for some of the reasons that I'd mentioned before, that even if he existed, that doesn't tell us whether or not his words are binding or his teachings should be followed or whether he was divine. But he was investigating this primarily because he had been asked to, and he spent a great deal of time. He came up with a particular model of using Bayes' theorem to assess historical claims, and then did the calculations and presented the book. Now, his methodology could be sound or unsound, and his calculations could be correct or incorrect, whether he has a bias or not. So this particular kind of character assassination, this sleazy poisoning the well, is wrong even if it wasn't already an attempt to poison the well, because not only have we not demonstrated any bias, but if there was a bias, it's not necessarily a bias towards this particular conclusion. And I find it interesting that instead of addressing the actual points that Carrier has made in both proving history and on the historicity of Jesus, that instead the singular response is that, he might have a bias because he likes to have sex. I don't see how that's relevant at all, because even if he did have a bias, his methodology could still be sound and his calculations could still be correct. I wonder if the author of the blog post has bothered to investigate either of those. You see, I could be biased towards a particular result, and if I get that result, we should examine my methodology. We shouldn't just assume that because I had a bias toward it that my result is somehow wrong. I might flip a coin and have a bias and really, really want it to come up heads, and if it comes up heads, that doesn't mean that I necessarily did something untoward to make it land heads. It could have just legitimately fallen that way. The fact that I'm expecting a result or that I would really wish for a result doesn't invalidate my findings. And in a follow-up blog post about this, he kind of pointed out that, some people were up in arms that I did this ad hominem fallacy or questioned his credibility. Well, that's exactly the same thing that the atheists do, like Dawkins and stuff, when they're talking about the Gospels, as to whether or not the authors of the Gospels should be considered reliable or if they have a bias. And this is the same thing. So if I can't do it with Carrier, they shouldn't be able to do it with the Bible. And I'm sorry, but he's wrong again. You see, when it comes to the Gospels, these are anonymous accounts that we cannot investigate. They are just a collection of claims and stories. And so whether or not we should believe them hinges almost entirely on whether or not the authors are credible. That's not the same as the case for Carrier's books. Carrier could be a terrible person. Carrier could have all kinds of biases, but he's presented two books, one outlining the methodology and one outlining the calculations, and those can be examined to determine if his case has any merit. We're not bound to just determining whether or not Carrier is credible and then taking his word for it. This is what happens when you have this particular religious mindset where you have to defend the reliability of Scripture when you should not defend it. There is absolutely no reason, no good reason to think that we should trust ancient anonymous writings that we can't investigate if they make claims that are outrageous, claims about miracles. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't happen. Maybe they did happen. Maybe everything in the Gospels is true, but what it means is we cannot confirm it, and we cannot have a sound, rational, justified belief in the claim that these things are actually true. So I'm wondering, have they actually investigated Carrier's claims? Or is this just an attempt to smear someone? Is this just an attempt to poison the well with this common kind of Christian attack of, oh, you atheists, you just love your sin. God has given you over to reprobate minds. You just don't want to live in a world governed by God. Y'all just love to sin. Essentially, the core claim here is that atheists, rather than honestly rejecting supernatural claims on the basis of insufficient evidence, have instead merely looked for some reason to reject the God that they don't want to serve. We're in love with our sin. The problem with this entire line of argument is that it essentially calls us liars. It's essentially saying that, yes, we hear you guys talk about evidence and burden of proof, but you're not really an atheist because of that. You're really just an atheist because you love to sin and you did not want to live under the yoke of God or under the responsibility of appealing and obeying God's positions. They don't offer any evidence of this, and they ignore the actual merits of our position and attempt to back up this entire dismissal by appealing to Scripture, which is, of course, circular. I've been accused of this many times, and I know they're wrong because I know why I'm not a believer. I know that I didn't set out to find some excuse for my sin. I didn't set out to get out from under the yoke of God. I set out to fulfill my obligation under 1 Peter 3:15, as I've said countless times. I was trying to be the best Christian I could, to be the best representative of Christianity and Christ that I could, and I wanted to be able to defend these ideas. And the fact that I found them indefensible is why I'm an atheist. The fact that I might disagree with a Christian or a Christian notion of sin might be important to some other discussion, but it's not the reason why I'm an atheist. And to say that we're lying, it's a dodge. It's in these conversations when they've attempted to present sound reasons for believing in God, and we have rejected those and offered our explanations for why, and have they met the burden of proof. And this is like one of the many last-ditch attempts. Frank Turek, an apologist that we've spoken about on the TV show before, I think Russell even did with a debate with him, he has this kind of anecdote that he tells about a friend of his who was out doing some preaching and letting people know about, God and giving his arguments for the existence of God. And there was a young agnostic who was being rather difficult and offering up tons of excuses and arguments for why he didn't believe. And this apologist looked at him and said, the reason you're raising all of these objections is because you're sleeping with your girlfriend. Am I right? And the way Turk tells it, the agnostic's face, fell and went white because he had felt the conviction that he was actually engaged in wrongdoing. This righteous arguer for God had demonstrated with one simple sentence that atheism is far more an issue of the heart than it is of the mind, and that we are just sinful reprobates who don't want to acknowledge that what we're doing is wrong. It comes up all the time. Y'all just want to sin. For years, I tried to encourage people to not only have good reasons for their atheism, to be more skeptical, to be critical thinkers, to evaluate the claims, and to be ready to give explanations for why we don't believe what the majority seems to believe. And I counseled people that when they are faced with this apologetic of someone saying you just want to sin, that what they should acknowledge is that essentially that person is avoiding the actual merits of the discussion, that they are calling them a liar, pretending that they can get into their head, and their justification for this is, much in the same way that the conversations with Cy went. They know that we're lying because their God says so, essentially, in the book, and they can't be wrong about that. And so it's a way for them to avoid this. And I encourage people to kind of get away from this, you just want to sin thing by putting the burden of proof where it should be. And I've changed my position slightly on how we should deal with you all just want to sin. Now, when I say I've changed my position, I still think it's important to put the burden of proof where it should be, to address the claims. But when they say you all just want to sin, and you can point out that they're not in any way making an argument for the existence of God, they're not even making an argument for belief in God, they're basically just saying you don't believe because, and this is irrelevant, it doesn't make any difference. On the one hand, I think I'd be willing to say, yes, I reject the very notion of sin. This idea that I can somehow offend or harm an immortal being by my mere thought or action is something that I find absurd. First of all, I don't care if I've offended somebody. I care if I've actually done harm to people, and I don't know how I could harm a God. So this idea of just rejecting the notion of sin is one that I would kind of stand behind. I'd also point out that there are things that they would identify as sin, and I would agree with them that those things are wrong. Murder immediately leaps to mind. But there are other things that they identify as sin that I don't see as wrong. I don't think it's wrong to love someone, even if they are of the same gender. I don't think it's wrong for adults to engage in consenting relationships, whether they be sexual or otherwise, unless there's some demonstration of harm. What business is it and what harm is it doing to anybody else who you sleep with, or how many people, or how often, or anything else? Their reasoning for why it's wrong is because God says so. It's somehow morally corruptive to our soul or offends God. But they haven't made any case for why we should care about that to begin with. And when you continue on in discussing the sorts of things that may or may not be sinful, you can, of course, get into things like, well, I don't believe that it's wrong to eat shellfish or wear polycotton blends. And usually they'll just blow that off and ignore it because that's the Old Testament and that's just more convenient and easier for them to ignore. I don't think it's wrong to work on Saturday or Sunday. I don't think it's wrong to question or doubt. I don't think it's wrong to disagree, even if there was a God. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to disagree and state your honest assessment that, I just don't understand this. Why did you make it so that I can't understand this? Why is it that this God's actions and the things that he supposedly endorses seem stupid and immoral to me? And yet they're actually moral and brilliant? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't agree that the worst thing I can do is to offend or somehow wound some immortal being through thought or action. But I didn't become an atheist because I already held those positions. I hold those positions because I'm an atheist, and more specifically, because I'm a humanist. Because I came to recognize that those positions are better than the ones that the Bible advocates. Those positions are better than the alternatives. I came to those positions because I recognized the value of humanism and equality. And when I was in Australia, I kind of addressed a Bible story, one that I think is far more important than a lot of people recognize when we're talking about the character of the Bible, of the God of the Bible. So I don't have my Bible handy, and I'm out here in the Bluebonnets in Texas. But I believe it's Genesis chapter 11, beginning at around verse 4, where we start to hear the story of the Tower of Babel. And I don't know about any of you, but what I was taught when I was a kid is that These people were arrogantly trying to build a tower to heaven. And there was a pridefulness. They were trying to reach God and put themselves at God's level. And because of that, God came down and changed their languages and confused their tongues and scattered them. But if you actually read what the Bible says, that apologetic that I was taught, that assessment of the Bible story that I was taught, doesn't hold any water. If you read what it says the people were of one tongue, and they set out to build a grand city and a tower to the heavens so that they would not become divided. They wanted to stay unified and work together. And when it says they built a tower to the heavens, the Hebrew word there simply means lofty or high in the sky. There's nothing in there that says this was out of arrogance or pride or an attempt to reach God. They wanted to build a tall tower, a symbol of their accomplishments. And I remember wondering as a kid, why would God be upset about this in the first place? I mean, we've been to the moon. We didn't encounter heaven or God in between the earth and the moon, and there's no way they're going to build a tower all the way to the moon. So if you were a God and you saw people building a tower, wouldn't you just say, oh, how cute, how quaint, they're trying to reach me, but they can't? The problem is the Bible doesn't say they're trying to reach God. They just wanted to build a tall tower. They wanted to remain unified. And God comes down and sees what they're doing, and what does he say? He says, look at these people. They're of one tongue, they are unified, and if things continue like this, there is nothing that they'll be unable to accomplish. Unity, good communication, and cooperation, the very keys to great accomplishment. These were evidently not a part of that God's plan, and so he came down and rained chaos and confused the tongues and scattered them. His plan did not include unity, good communication, and cooperation. And so he set out to spoil their attempts at those. But that also failed. Just like everything else this God attempts to do in the Bible, it failed. Because we have accomplished great things. What the biblical God was objecting to, in the form of unity, communication, and cooperation, these are the cornerstones of humanism. These are good things. You probably won't get too many believers to acknowledge that these are actually good things once they realize these are the cornerstones of humanism and this is what their God was opposed to. But outside of that context, I would think all of us would agree that unity, cooperation, and communication are great. As a matter of fact, if this Bible story actually happened, and we know it didn't, we know this is not the way languages came about. This is almost certainly just an ancient attempt to explain the diversity of language and the diversity of culture on the planet. So it didn't happen this way. But even if it did, it tells us that this God of the Bible is a monster who doesn't want us to accomplish things. He needs to keep us needy and under his thumb. I said once before, if God is not a humanist, I don't want anything to do with him. And I would hope that if there is a God and he's not a humanist, that he's at least willing to listen. I talked a little bit more about this in Australia. If he's not a humanist, he's wrong, because the values of humanism are far superior to the values that we find in the Bible. And the theist will want to jump on this and say, see, you're admitting it. You are rejecting God because you don't want to live under his authority. I'm rejecting God because I don't think he exists. But even if I did think that he exists, I would not want to live under his authority because I don't recognize that his authority and his reported values are in fact moral or good. And my question to them is, why would you want to or be willing to live underneath such an authority of a being who expects worship and obedience? I would argue that any being who expects worship isn't worthy of it. A being who sanctions slavery, who doesn't support equality, who has a problem with unity, communication, and cooperation. I don't believe that your God is real. But if he is, and the Bible or the Quran are accurate depictions of his character, he's unworthy of respect. He's unworthy of adherence to his policies. His policies, if the Bible's accurate, are wrong. So if you say, I'm just a believer or just a non-believer because I want to sin, you're wrong. I'm a non-believer because I've actually evaluated this, and I don't find sufficient evidence that any of this is true. But I've also evaluated it on moral grounds as well, and I don't find any reason to think that the bulk of it is good. I don't find anything good about religion that can't be accomplished without religion, so keep the good and get rid of the baggage. But if in an argument, if in a discussion, you've presented your reasons, you presented your evidence, you've explained why you don't accept something, and they come back with some sort of accusation about your character, that you just don't want to live under the yoke of a God, then I think it's fine to acknowledge that in addition to not seeing any reason to think this is real, if it were real, you also wouldn't worship, because you value unity, communication, cooperation, equality, the sorts of things that their God doesn't advocate for, the sorts of things that the God character in the Bible and the Quran is opposed to. If they want to label that sin, fine, I really don't care about the concept of sin. But if they want to say it's wrong, then we can have a separate discussion about why the Bible sanctions immoral things like slavery, that we can pretty much all agree is immoral, and why it doesn't sanction moral things, why it seems opposed to the intellectual pursuit of truth in the world, of being intellectually honest about your findings, and punishing people for their thoughts, punishing people for perhaps not being gullible or not seeing why it's somehow wrong to love or care about someone just because they have the same gender or just because you're not married to them, when marriage is a state institution anyway. So no matter which apologist you're hearing it from, this idea that y'all want to sin is a way for them to avoid the discussion. It's a way for them to attempt to poison the well in some cases or attack your character so that they don't actually have to defend what it is that they actually believe. And don't let them get away with it. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.